Good evening, good evening. Everybody, welcome. We're going to take about a minute, maybe a little bit less, as the room fills up. We have a pretty good crowd tonight, which is always fun to see. Thank you so much for being here tonight, being part of our conversation. I do hope to make it a conversation. I'm going to save time at the end for discussion, make sure I've answered all your questions. But I've, got some slides first. You will be receiving a recording of this. We're going to do a recording, and we're going to send it out to everybody who has a link. Everyone who signed up, feel free to share it. We post it on YouTube, so you can fast forward to the good parts. But we're starting to hit a plateau. Give it another like 20 seconds, and then we'll dive in. Hope everyone's having a nice early June day. Coming in from California, it's going to be probably a pretty hot day over there. I was reading about that big heat dome. Somehow in Atlanta, we've avoided that for the last couple summers. It's been very nice. But actually going to the beach tomorrow. Going to Jacksonville beaches where it's going to be in the mid-90s, which should be fun for the kids and for me too. All right, so I think we're about there. Why don't we jump right in? So I'm Dr. Jed Appleruth, founder of Appleruth Tutoring Services, tonight talking about the SAT and the ACT, two of my favorite tests that are out there, and the differences. I'm also giving a broader context about testing, and that's the name of the deck, in terms of where it fits, thinking about it, and then I'll take your questions, which may be more specific to the tests themselves. So thanks again for being here. I hope you all learned some good stuff. All right, so the overlap, the Venn diagram, they overlap about 80%, and that's substantial. They didn't used to when they first started out in the late 50s. The ACT and ST overlapped maybe like 30, 40%, but there's been a convergence over the many iterations and changes to the test. They always learn from each other. It's a competitive dynamic duopoly thing, but there's a lot of overlap and what they're assessing and how they're assessing it. Although there have been some pretty big changes in the last year or so in terms of duration of the test, the method of delivery, paper versus electronic. So there are some big differences, but content-wise, there's a lot of overlap. When it comes to reading level, the reading level in the SAT is about 2 years greater. We're talking like an 11th grade reading level in the SAT versus about a 9th on the ACT. So you're going to see more advanced passages on the SAT. And for some kids, no problem. For some kids, the reading burden is a little bit heavy on the SAT. The ACT has more advanced mathematics. It goes deeper into Algebra 2 and even a little bit more trig. And there's also a 40-question science section. There's nothing similar on the SAT. You have a science passage in there, of a couple small, short science passages, little paragraphs. I have a few math items which have a science context, but not a 40-item, half-an-hour section on science. So that is one also clear distinction. So there's more STEM on the ACT. Now, these structures, you have a short test. You have the SAT, which is they have two verbal sections, reading and writing. There's the baseline module, then you have the adaptive module, then you have a 10-minute break, then you have your baseline math, then your adaptive math, whether it goes easy or hard, depending upon your performance on the first baseline module. The ACT is not adaptive. It is just 4 static paper tests. You have a reading module, and then an English module. So verbal first, take a break, 10 minutes, come back, bathroom break. Then you have your math module, then you have your science module, and then you're done. Some kids then have a experimental section where they're going to take some questions which don't count, but they're going to inform levels of difficulty on questions, make sure there's no bias in questions for future tests. That's not for every kid, but it happens for some of the times. So obviously these are different structures of the test. Now, let's talk for a little bit about the digital SAT. We've already had now multiple administrations for over a year. We had 7 international administrations of the digital SAT. We had the digital PSAT in October. Then we've had the March, then we had the May, and then we'll have the June digital SAT. So the digital SAT becoming more normalized. Kids are getting more familiar with it. The first administration was a little bit tough in March. It was the math section we learned was harder than the blue book tests that kids have been prepping on. So there was a little bit of a panic. but now everyone realized that's just what the new math is. It's a little bit harder, not a big deal. It was similar for the May test, and we expect a similar math difficulty level in the June test. So again, you have these baselines. So, and the harder math came on the adaptive hard section. Everyone takes a baseline section that looks pretty similar, the baseline verbal, baseline math. If I do about better than 2/3 correct, I'm going to the harder module. If I get under 2/3 correct, I'm going to the easier module. And that applies for the verbal and for the math. So that's how it's an adaptive digital test. It's adaptive. The time per question is very different. The SAT is giving kids a lot more time per question. And some of the questions are multi-level. They're a little more challenging. The level of reading is more challenging. And so we're finding that some kids are actually needing the extra time, especially on the advanced, the adaptive module, less so on the baseline. The baseline, most everyone finishes, but on the adaptive, if you go to the hard module, some kids have to work to make sure they hit their timing. But the time per question, 70 seconds on the verbal SAT versus 44 on the ACT, 95 seconds on the verbal SAT, on the math SAT versus a minute flat on the AC. So you have 60% more time per question, which is meaningful. And that really does make a difference for kids. And then in terms of the number of items, you have a tremendous, difference. You have 98 items total on the SAT versus 215 on the ACT. So, and on the verbal section, you have 54 items to establish your verbal score on the SAT versus 115 verbal items to get your score on the ACT. So you have a lot more questions. And that is the beauty of adaptive testing. I don't have to ask you everything, all the easies, all the middles, all the hards. Some students, I'm going to omit and avoid a lot of the hards. If they're lower level kids, some students, much more advanced with verbal, I'm going to omit a lot of the easy ones. And that's how I can cull a lot of the irrelevant items and get to a more efficient, streamlined problem set that's tailor-made for the student. That's why anything adaptive is superior, in my opinion, as a educational psychology guy. All right, the content is similar, but still there is going to be more algebra, a lot of algebra 1 and algebra 2 on the SAT. Geo and trig, you have twice as much on the ACT. Geometry is really not a big deal on the SAT. Maybe you see three questions, maybe 4. And they both have some data analysis, charts, tables, graphing, and so forth. All right. And I mentioned that there's more advanced math on the ACT, and that's going to come, you're never going to see a matrix multiplication, division on the SAT, but you're going to see matrices for the advanced problems on the ACT. You're going to see a conic section. They're going to ask you to know the formula for an ellipse or a parabola. You're going to have to understand the domains and ranges of functions. They're going to have, radians. Some of these more advanced trig concepts, which do not ever appear on the SAT. So there is some more advanced math. But again, it only applies to maybe the top 5, 6, 7 questions. So it's not the whole test is more advanced. But when you get to the upper, and these, you're going to see one matrix question or log question or one domain or asymptote question. You're not going to see like 6 of them. But the advanced content does rotate. So kids going for a very high score on the ACT have to get exposed to, this wider array of more advanced concepts, which never appear on the SAT. So the formatting is different. Even though the question types, they're going to ask you about evidence and they're going to ask you about vocab and context, but the SAT gives you short little mini passages. They could be 4 or 5 sentences up to 7 or 8, 4 or 5 lines, it could be up to 7 sentences, but they're short with a max of 150 words. Versus the ACT, you can have passages that are 800 words long, that are 10 questions apiece on this big long form passage. And so, and 15 questions on the reading and 10 on the 15 on English and 10 on reading. So they're different formats. The SAT is like TikTok, where they give you a passage, you finish it, boom, next question. It could be, now you're on to grammar, next question, then another reading question, boom. And so it's one little tiny, few sentences, hit the question, it's brand new. There's not this big, long 10 question passage that is only now on the ACT. So that's different. Some kids prefer it. Some, it's just a matter of preference. No, so the digital SAT, when it comes to reading and writing, you have 54 questions. When it comes to math, 44 questions, and that's it. Embedded in those, you're going to have 2 experimental questions, which don't count towards your score, but they count towards helping, the test writers make sure there's no bias in future questions and making sure they can help calibrate how hard questions are. But so eight of your questions are experimental. So of the 98 questions, only 90 count towards a score, and 8 of them are experimental. I mentioned adaptive. I'm going to explain what that means. And there's a question, kids are wondering, should I, did I go to the easy module or the hard module? The truth of it is, the SAT, the College Board never tells you if you went into the easy or hard module. The only way to differentiate, if I scored more than like a 650, then I went to the hard module. And that really is where the cutoff is. If I get a 720, I definitely went to the hard module. But if I get a 580, I don't know. I could have went to the easy module and done very well. I could have went to the hard module and done not so well. But if you see, a lot harder items, typically that's when you went to the hard module. And the administration, it's digital. It's on the Blue Book app, which all students now know if they took the PSAT. And it's going to be the app that we're going to be running the AP exams on next year for 8 APs. APs eventually are all going digital as well, starting off with some of the basics like APUSH and English. And, eventually we're going to add the more challenging ones like the maths and sciences. But we're starting off with a lot of the verbal ones, verbal heavy, text heavy APs, and next May are going to be on the Blue Book app. And you enter a code, and then boom, your test is unlocked, and you dive into it. And it's self-administered. You're not waiting for the teacher to call time to give you breaks. It's all on your laptop, and which a lot of kids like very much. All right, the timer is built in. You can bring your calculator, but there's also an embedded calculator in the software. It's called Desmos, and it's very important. And any students taking the SAT need to practice learning how to use Desmos. That's something that's different because that's not available on the ACT. So that is one distinction. And any accommodations you have, extra breaks, extra time, it's all baked in, built into the Blue Book application itself. All right, and so the structure of this, it goes in a very, a basic order. You have these, 27 questions, but they follow this sequence. It starts off, they're going to ask you, 5, 6 questions of craft and structure. That'll be some words and context, and it's going to balance back and forth between grammar, like the writing aspect, and then the reading aspect. Then there'll be cross-text connections. When that phase is done, we go to info and ideas. That's evidence, inference questions. Again, it's going to be a lot of reading, but some grammar. Then we shift over to standard English conventions. That's predominantly grammar. That's going to be boundaries, forms, structure, and sense. And then expression of ideas. That's going to be transitions and rhetorical synthesis. So we're having, this is the basic format of every verbal section on the SAT. One nice thing is at the bottom, you can hover over this little review thing, and it shows up where am I in my section, and it shows if I have any I didn't answer, and if I flag any for review at the end. It's nifty, and a lot of kids use this feature. It's a very popular feature that I think is very helpful. And so you can never get off gridding. We had students during the most recent ACT, and they got off on their gridding and they missed a bunch. You can never get off on your gridding because the problem in front of you, I circle the answer, next question. There's no more gridding. It's just I'm clicking, choice D. You also have an answer eliminator. I can cross off answers going through and things like that. Here's just some examples of what it looks like. Frustrated with the blank of terms. This person coined the term to describe the genre, yada, yada, yada. So are you frustrated with something positive or negative? Probably something, variety, no, but limitations, maybe, obscurity. But then once you read it, it's going to be, lead, limit, limitation. So this is a basic fill in the word. And so the vocabulary is not very advanced. They're not going to full, brute strength ask you a hard vocab question. However, they're going to throw in terms like Afrofuturism into the passage. But they're not going to ask you like brute force. Have you memorized what this advanced word means? Maybe obscurity may be the hardest word in that mix, but not like on the SATs of old, kids were memorizing vocab words. That's all done. And again, here we go, inference questions. This will be a science question. And looking for the, completion. And so polyurethanes, it's science passage. Again, this is what you get. This is everything you're looking at. However, they're hard to recycle, can have bad chemicals. They're trying to research an alternative to poly called lignin. Tests are positive. Pilot and Sternberg will need to determine whether the database forms are blank. And then there's, they throw the questions at you, are comfortable, can be varied. And so this is, basic format, basic structure. So the math section, it goes from easy to hard. Whereas on verbal, you're going easy to hard in these little waves for the ST. On math, it just goes easy to hard questions. They're predominantly multiple choice, but some of them are student response. And you have your calculator, and you also have a scratch paper, which they can replenish if you run out of scratch paper. If I hover over the reference formulas, it pops up. Here's the formula for a circle, for for the area, for the volume of a cylinder, things like that. Some of the basic Pythagorean, like the triangles, a squared, b squared. So that's right there. And the calculator, Desmos, if I click the calculator, Desmos emerges. So very powerful stuff. Math is much less of a reading test than it has been for the last 10 years. Only 30% are in context of science or word problems. The rest of them are just pure math. And so that's a nice change. And Desmos can solve a lot of problems for you, and anyone taking this test needs to learn how to use Desmos, period, paragraph, full stop. And you can go on desmos.com and practice. Appleruth, we have a whole guide to this. It's part of our instruction, but you definitely want to practice, and then Blue Book can practice. And as an example of this, so you have these equation systems, basic algebra, and the whole thing is, what's the value of y? And so I could solve it, and I could isolate and solve for x, solve for y, or I just plug these in Desmos, and then boom, the y value where they intersect is x is 5, and then y is 3. So the answer is 3. That's nifty. So Desmos is a time saver, especially on the first module. Same thing, a quad formula, y equals 2x squared plus x minus 21. And they're asking me, what's the distance of the line segment AB? So the zeros are at A and B. On the coordinate plane, what's the distance? So I could do this formula and solve that, or I plug this in graphically, and the distance between my zeros, were across the x-axis, that's between negative 3.5 to 3. Let's do the math, it's 6.5. So again, there are nifty techniques and tricks of using this calculator. It's best in class, and kids need to learn how to use it. All right. Now, I mentioned that there's this real distinction between easy and hard modules based on your performance. So if you get about 2/3 right, you're going to go to the hard module, under that easy module. And let me show you how it looks a little bit different. So the math, this is the baseline module. I have 2 really easy questions, level 1. I have 10 level 2, still easier, but a little harder. I have 7 level 3. I have 3 level 4. So it goes, I'm skewing, most of my questions are in the middle. I have a few easy, a few really hard, mostly in the middle. If I don't do as well, then I'm going here. And then suddenly I have 7 level 1, not 2. I have 9 level 2. So I have 16 easier questions. And then I have only 5 level 3 and 1 level 4, and only 5. So it skews much more towards easy. That's on the easy module. If, however, I go to the hard module, it looks like this. I only have 1 level 1 and 4 level 2. So in lieu of having 16, I have 5 easy questions, but then they're stacking the deck with level 3 and then level 4. So you see how it's different, and how kids have to be able to adapt. If they're on the baseline module, then suddenly, boom, I have more challenging. And this is actually, I should probably update this, because this is on test 1, which we've since learned is actually relatively too easy. So imagine that curve with even more on level 4 side. And that's what we're seeing, that there's even more challenging items than they showed us in the first few tests of the Blue Book. Additionally, this is kind of inside baseball, but one change is that, and this is relevant in terms of what the score giveback looks like, different test items have different relative weights. For about 95 years, from 1926 to this year, every item on the test was one raw point, and it converted to a scale point. Not anymore. Now what happens is different questions have different weights. And so if you miss this one, it could have a higher weighting if it's more of a foundational concept versus a more like advanced problem, not as fundamental, may count less. And so, but that makes the scoring more complicated. It's algorithmic scoring, not this basic conversion. And additionally, one thing that every student is going to have their test will be a little bit different. And the differences we're seeing are the order can change within, like, my number 3 is your number 7, or within a small band on the math, or it could be for that same question, my answer is B, your answer is D for the exact same problem. They just reverse the order. And it could be that for some of the math questions, they're changing it slightly. So I have a 3, 4, 5 triangle, and you have a 6, 8, 10 triangle. So my answer is 10 pi, and your answer, is 5 pi. And so we are seeing that kind of difference. So that also makes this test much more secure and harder to cheat. That's the whole point. That's one of the main things. You gain efficiency, the test is shorter, and it's harder to cheat, which is a good thing. The way you prep, practice tests. And now there are not 4 practice tests, there are 6 in the Blue Book. And I believe maybe we're on the way to 8. And so I have to check myself if we already have the 8th one out there. But that was coming. And so I should probably update that slide. My bad for that. But practice tests. So take your practice tests and then get very cozy with Desmos. You want to learn how to use it, take your practice, learn the pacing. And don't worry so much, which module am I in? Just every problem, approach it like it's all that matters. Don't think, am I in the easy one or hard one? Is this experimental or not? Does this weigh more than the other questions? You're never going to know that. So just like everyone who comes in front of you, do your best and then move on. And so this is meaningful. Like the inside baseball of the scoring is meaningful because your test return looks like this. It's these heat maps. The heat maps have nothing to do. You don't know which question you missed. You don't know how many questions you missed. They don't tell you really much of anything. And that's because in the new world, this student missed 7 questions and got, throwing numbers out, 680. This other kid missed 7 questions and got, a 640, based on which questions and which module, which sections. And so it doesn't line up exactly because, again, there are different items with different weights and different modules have different weights. So that's why the scoring is definitely more opaque. So one of the things Appleware does, we have 3 fully formed practice tests, which we give much more robust feedback, which can be helpful to supplement what you're working with on the Blue Book app. All right, accommodations, they're given the same. The breaks are just built in, timing's built in. You can change the font size for kids who have learned differences. And they have an accommodation, they have text-to-speech, they bring a headphone, and so forth. All right, and the feedback has been good. And here's some of the feedback from the harder math module. It looks more like this. And so you have just a lot harder level. There are a lot more advanced items that we saw. So that was one shift for the March test. Students we worked with, and again, we have worked with now international kids for over a year, but almost a year and a quarter. And the vast majority seem to like the short test. They like that you start at, you start at 8:30, you're done in 2.5 hours. The administration with the break is 2 hours and 24 minutes, and you're done, and you walk out. There's no picking up Scantrons. There's no matching Scantrons with booklets. You finished, and you're done. So there are a lot of reasons why the administration likes this, prefers this, and the students do. There have been a few issues here and there with a little bit of Wi-Fi. You only need Wi-Fi for a moment at the beginning to unlock your test, and then the whole thing runs on your device. And then the Wi-Fi is not needed at all. At the very, very end, before you walk out, you're ready to upload your score, you need Wi-Fi connectivity for, again, like 3 seconds, upload your answers, and that's it. Everything else happens because you've already pre-downloaded the test days before you go into the testing center. That's one of the fun things about this. So they thought of a lot of stuff. And so, if you need a power cord, they can get you one at the center. Ideally, you bring a power cord. Ideally, your thing is charged up, but they have a tech room to help kids, and they've tried to, they have cords for extension cords and things like that, and they have some basic power cords, but definitely bring one on day off. Why kids like it? Test is shorter. Passages are short. You have more time per question, and you always have a calculator, and your results come back. They're saying eventually you'll get your answers back within 3 days. Right now, it's more like several weeks, but we expect that to come down as we have a few more tests under our belt. All right, and so the ACT, they are offering a digital test, but it's digital and non-adaptive, which means it's still 215 items, still the same timing. There are really no benefits. It's not a better test. However, this June, it might be this weekend, they're doing a trial shorter ACT for a select number of kids who sign up for a lottery. The kids aren't going to know till the day of if they're doing the shorter version or the regular version. It'll be digital. But if that goes well and kids like it, I would not be surprised in the next year, year and a half, if we see a shorter digital ACT coming to the marketplace because they don't want to lose market share, and they've already been losing market share. The SAT is actually a lot more popular. It's like 1.9 million kids to 1.3 million kids. So the ACT kind of fell off. They were the dominant test not 10 years ago, but now they have fallen off their perch. Timelines. You have 7 ACTs, September, October, December, Feb, April, June, July, and you have 7 SATs, August, October, November, December, March, May, and June. So there are testing options during the summer, in the fall, in the winter. There is a bit of a hiatus between December and March. That's the biggest break during the year. Otherwise, you don't go more than a couple months before you have a test available to you. So that's pretty handy. And there are different schedules to some kids do some prep over the summer, very common. Then they may lock in a score with the August SAT, then walk away from it for a while and come back in the spring. Totally fine, as long as you do a little refresher, you review. I like having students take at least one practice test within a month of any official test. Get yourself back in the mindset. Some kids do winter prep. They do a class, or they just do their own work. Then they go and knock out 3 in a row. It could be they do the February, April, June ACT. It could be all summer. It could be the June, July, September test. One thing that's important if you're going to be a senior, a lot of kids, you want to finish testing ideally by the September ACT or by the August SAT. Some schools with early deadlines in October will not accept the October SAT, so make sure testing is done. I like it being done, ideally before you start senior year. Testing should be finished in my book. You could keep taking it. Again, after your early apps are submitted, you're going to have the October SAT, the November SAT, and the December. And if testing is not where you want it to be, totally appropriate to go and keep taking them. But most kids go for their best shot for their early app, whether it's early decision or single choice early action, whatever they're going for. And you want to have your best score ready before you submit to your probably most selective school in October. And so that's the 1st of November, whatever, one of those. So, but then obviously November and December, those tests are very much relevant for when you're applying regular decision in January for schools. All right, I mentioned we have 3 practice tests and in-depth analysis, very handy. And now let me just talk briefly. There are a few questions coming in. I'm going to answer them all when we get to the Q&A. It's 8:28. We'll have plenty of time. So just broadly thinking about testing, we had these 2 assessments, the ACT. Some kids still do better on that test, even though it's longer. Again, it's a lower reading level. It's has more science, more math. Some kids who are less verbally inclined, more math science inclined, still prefer the ACT. You have to move fast, but there are kids who are pretty quick with pacing. But then a lot of kids seem to prefer the SAT these days because it's a shorter test. The reading is more advanced, but the math's a little bit easier, and you have more time per question. So that's how to think about these differences. And some a lot of kids like that it's 98 questions versus 215 questions. They're like, wow, that really wasn't that bad. Understanding that the math module and the advanced section is hard, but we now have these advanced math packets, and kids can prep for that now. So it's not really a surprise like it was in March. And now we expect it. It's going to be more challenging. But broadly, test scores. So I'll talk for about 10 minutes, then I'll go to questions. The world is still test optional, but a lot of selective schools in the past 5 months, many of the top schools in the country went back to test required, and there are definitely more coming. And we're probably set for this cycle of admissions, but for next cycle, we're going to for sure have more schools popping. I'm waiting to hear about what UNC is going to do, But like the most recent one to shift back was Cornell, but they're saying not for this cycle. They just announced um, after Harvard and after Caltech. But Cornell said, we're giving kids this cycle a pass, but after that, testing is required for every kid who's applying. Test blind is test optional, flexible. So here's kind of, it was the last 4 months. Like Dartmouth popped in February, then Yale went within weeks, Brown, UT Austin, then Harvard, then Caltech, then Cornell. After MIT and Georgetown and other schools and like Florida never left. Georgia came back in 2021 for the flagship schools. UNC had a meeting in May, and the North Carolina system of higher ed. And if you have under a 2.8, which most kids don't, then you have to have test score. But they're allowing individual schools to determine their requirements. So I'm expecting very strongly UNC Chapel Hill, the flagship school, and possibly NC State to be test required within a year. And I'm waiting, what will happen with UVA after Texas, and now Georgia and Florida and Tennessee. We're seeing a lot more of the Southern schools going back. And I expect that trend to continue, especially the flagship schools, the big state schools we're out of state. It's hard to get in. Like UNC Chapel Hill, out of state, the admit rate is 6%. UT Austin, out of state, the admit rate is 8%. Crazy. These are like, they're called public Ivies for a reason, because so many of those seats are taken up by kids in state based on their, these are land grant schools, so it's required with a charter. But out of state, it's getting very tough. And so with all these applications, all these kids with good grades, the fact, going test required, it makes some sense. I understand it. And so here, again, there's more coming, but these are the schools that are test required now. And the rationales are we can't predict who will do well at these top schools without test scores, because too many kids have high grades. There's been a lot of grade inflation over the past 20 years. And then the research, they run their regression analyses, very basic. You find the coefficients for testing, and test scores predict a higher portion of performance than do high school grades. Same thing are from Yale. They're all saying the same thing. High school grades explain a lot more than, high school grades explain less than testing at Dartmouth. And then here we go. Test submitters at UT had better GPAs than kids without testing. So you understand the rationale. And that's why I expect more schools to be joining, because I'm assuming these schools aren't that distinct from other schools who are very selective or big state schools. So we'll see. And some of the research came from, there's a genius, a future Nobel laureate, Raj Chetty, over at Harvard, doing all this big data analysis. And he found that, yeah, testing is a better predictor of performance than freshmen, than high school grades. And here's the the distinction. So just showing you that testing predicts in a fairly linear fashion what your grades will be in college, but then high school grades really don't do that well at predicting grades in college. So, and then, yeah, this is UT Austin. So again, that's why having all A's, a lot of kids have all A's. Having strong testing can be a differentiator. And again, the publics, I mentioned there are more states coming, Tennessee, all the Florida schools, the Georgia flagships, and so forth. And so expect this map to fill in more in the South. The Carolinas, could be South Carolina. And also the big selected, I'm waiting for Princeton, waiting for Penn, I'm waiting for USC and California. There are going to be more top schools, maybe Chicago, really, really great schools who will be test required, I believe, within a year. Could be Alabama, we'll see. Auburn's interesting. They're doing something called, it's test optional, but it's conditional. If I have a 3.58, I must send my test score. And I had a student I was talking to about this earlier. 3.7, I choose. Under that, it's up to me. All right. And then there are about 70 or so schools that are test blind. I got to update that, but most of them are in California, about more than half of them. And then there are schools they're encouraging you. Like if you don't submit a score, we have less information. Like, we'd like you to have a score. Same thing with Boston College. They just came out with their guidance change that we'd like you to send scores. We encourage you. And when I see that, that's a signal to me that scores matter for that school. They also matter for merit aid. I live in Georgia. There's a Zell Miller scholarship. And if I don't have a 2025 ACT or 1200, then I'm not eligible for the full scholarship. Other schools too. Alabama. My niece applied here, and she got a 1390 SAT and had great grades. So they threw a bunch of money at her. They offered her the UA Scholar, which is $24,000 a year. So they're, we're knocking, tuition goes from $32,000 out of state down to $8,000. And that's meaningful. That's really, they're trying, and they've really changed the quality of their graduates and their classes by using merit-based aid, not financial-based aid. And so if schools are test optional, it does not mean they are test blind. Again, that's something we learned when some of these schools announced that they were going test required again. They were saying like the rates of admission were really quite different for kids with test scores. And so you want to figure out, do I send my scores or not? If you have scores that are strong in their, in the middle 50, I would probably say send them. In most cases, if I have scores below that, I'll probably withhold them. Like, is there an advantage? And the answer, like Boston College, again, just changed their guidance. And it's, kids applying with test scores. 17,000 kids applied with test scores, 20,000 applied without test scores. Who got in? 5,000 kids got in with scores and only 2,500 without. So the admit rate was almost 3x. So a very meaningful advantage, which is why they're saying now it's test optional. Now we encourage you, albeit optional. It's to your advantage to have testing, and it is. Yale came out and they said, after they announced their return to testing, they said, well, we didn't tell them this for 3 years, but our admit rate with tests is 6% and without it's 2%. So again, it's 3x. And we're seeing that most schools don't share this. And some of them are sharing it when they go test required. But the schools like Colgate, they've released this. Tech, before they were been required, it was double. Notre Dame is almost 2-to-1. Emory's 2-to-1. UVA. And so we don't have this data set. This is only from press releases and, things we've gathered in the news. And some of this data is, a couple years old. But most schools, it's not captured in the common data set. It's not captured on the websites. They don't advertise this because part of the thing is they want more kids to apply. That helps them with whether you have scores or not. But in terms of the internal machinations of their, admissions office, yeah, test scores are still having a weight, but then not the same effect. Like look at Vandy. Test scores didn't have the same weight at Vandy as they did, let's say, at Emory or at Boston College or at Yale. So different schools put different weights, but every school does their own thing. And Jeremiah, that was his thing. It's like, yeah, I became more and more convinced that we weren't being honest about the reality of our process. So with kids who weren't submitting were hurting their chances. This is Yale. It's very selective. Other colleges, not at all. I gave a talk in May up in Connecticut with a UConn admissions, subdirector, and he said, yeah, UConn, we're getting 3 out of 10 kids send test scores. They're not the same as they are at Yale. So schools that are more selective, test scores matter more. Schools that are less selective, test scores matter less. So you send test scores if they contribute, if they're strong scores, you want to send them. If not, you want to withhold them. Do not send a weak score that's below their middle 50 percentile typically, unless there's something really extraordinary about you, unless you come from a region that's really underrepresented or you have some status that the school might want. Your first generation student, low income, zip code or school. Otherwise, if you're from a fairly affluent zip code or school district and your scores are really, really, really weak, I would not send them. They're not going to help you. Also, differential rates by major, that like kids applying to engineering, they want to showcase their math skills. So they want to showcase that 33 on the ACT math or that 750 on math for the SAT. Also a higher rate submission for the business kids, but much lower rates for education majors or gen ed or but the STEM kids, the engineers and the science kids and the pre-med kids, often they're trying to showcase their science, their math chops, and that's why they send test scores at a higher rate. Rick Clark, friend, colleague, says, if you're in the upper half, send it. If you're in the bottom quarter, I probably wouldn't send it. Go with your strengths instead. Here's an example of that for the Buffs. Their middle 50 range, half the kids are applying between 1170 and 1380. If I have, let's say, a 1270 or above, send it. If I have below an 1170, unless I'm first gen or something special, I probably wouldn't. That third quartile, it really depends a little bit. If I have a 1250, I'd probably send it. If I have an 1180, I'm towards the low end of the range, and I have amazing grades and amazing academic rigor and have a bunch of 5s on the APs and 4s or a bunch of strong IBs, I probably wouldn't send it. But if my grades are only okay, I have a 3.5, 3.6, I don't have as much rigor, but I have like a 1240, then I'd probably send it. unless, okay, there's also a consideration if I'm applying to an engineering program and I have a really good math score in there, I have like a 700 in math, but then a 560 in verbal, I probably still send it to give them that knowledge that my math is 700, I'm top 2%. And so applying to your engineering program. But less so if I'm applying to an engineering program and my math is weak, don't tell them that. Don't send that score. Only if it strengthens. And there has been a general trend where, the average scores have been rising. There's definitely been some inflation over the past, couple years post-COVID. And so we see Yale didn't move. They didn't change what they admitted. But schools like, Tulane, like they're wiping out. It's the bottom quartile of kids who are not saying test scores. When they withhold their scores, it drives up the averages. Like Vermont, their mid-range was an 1182 of 1340 pre-pandemic. Now the range is 1280 to 1420. Did kids get that much smarter? Vermont, no. But kids with lower scores stop sending them. And so the averages increased. And that's just something to be mindful of. Oh, and this is a hard slide to read. But colleges get more apps and they become more selective when they're test optional. It's just to show you that, the apps increased for all these schools that went test optional. That's one of the reasons why schools like test optional. And so Brown said, hey, median test scores have risen as students with weaker scores had chose not to submit. And these inflated scores may be intimidating, but still, I would look back. You can look back and type in the term common data set and look at a school, look at Emory's common data set for testing. I think it's C9. In 2020, it'll tell you what scores were competitive a couple years ago. And that, it shouldn't be that different. Even if you're getting rid of a lot of lower scores, I think a few years ago. So let's open this thing up. And I know we have 9 questions. And let me get to them. And what do we have? 18 minutes. So go ahead right now, type in your questions, and I promise to get to them. On the SAT, is it better to not do well on the baseline so you get the easier? No, don't do that. Don't try to tank the baseline. It's not going to work to your advantage because you are capped at around a 650, 660, 640. You're in that range. You can't get higher than that. So if I move to the easier module, I can crush that module, get all of them right. But my ceiling now is I can't get over a 670, no matter how hard I try. So unless that's a score you want, I wouldn't tank the baseline. Do your best on the baseline. Okay. All right. Next up. Right. Is there a minimum? Yeah. And the answer, it's another baseline question. If I go easy adaptive, yeah, I'm stuck. I'm not getting 680. So you don't want to do that. Difference between the online and the computer ACT and the paper ACT. It's the exact same test. No difference. There's no advantage. It's not shorter. They're on different items. It's just a paper. It's like a digital version of a paper test. So in my book, there's no reason to take it. I see no advantage unless the only reason schools are doing it is because the window for administering the test gets broader for the school day testing. They have like a span of 3 weeks to give the test versus they have like 2 days with the paper because they can push the day of a different test. They can push form 30F or 36H or 25D. And, versus with paper, that stack of papers is sitting there. It's all the same test form. And so there's liability versus there's a bigger range they could push because they have that ability to load the test in like the morning of. Okay. Is there a limit on how many times you can take the digital SAT? No, there's not. Although in our experience, taking it more than 3 times, like at the absolute most 4 times, typically you're not going to get any better. And most kids begin getting tired. They start hitting a peak, a plateau. And there are even diminishing returns, even negative returns. When you take multiple SATs, ACTs, how will they be graded? Average or the best one picked? So the majority of colleges now are super scoring the SAT or super scoring the ACT. So that means they're going to take your best verbal from March, your best math from May, and that becomes your super score. And you can look it up on College Board. The big future is if schools super score, but more and more and more are. Especially a couple of years ago, the ACT came out and said, we've done our research and it turns out super scoring is a valid predictor, and therefore we endorsed it. So now both the College Board and ACT, they both endorse super scoring. And very few schools average. Most of them either take the best in one sitting, but the majority will take the cherry pick and they'll super score. Can you explain why adaptive is fair? It seems like students get penalized by having to answer harder questions. Well, they're getting credit for having made it to the advanced module, and they're going to get harder questions, but also the scoring is different. So they're going to get harder questions. But again, some of the easier questions in that adaptive module are going to count more. And so it's a fair thing, even though it's skewed towards hard items. By the fact that you went to the hard module, you're already a leg up because you're getting credit for all the questions you got right on the front of the baseline, and also some of the questions that are a little easier still count more. So missing the hard questions, like they understand they're getting harder questions, but you still want to be ideally in the harder module if you can. Is it true that the math was harder on the March digital test than the May? No. That our experience was the March and May test were comparable and on the adaptive advanced math section. What happened is kids got wise to the fact that, okay, math is now, they gave all these questions that were multi-phase questions. Like one example, they gave these similar triangle question, and you had to first, and it was all text, but they explained that there are two similar triangles. One has a side length of 8, one has a side length of whatever. So you get the ratio down. They want you to, use Pythagorean theorem to determine, the hypotenuse, and then convert that over to the similar triangle. And so you had to do like 3 or 4 things. You had to first draw the triangles, understand the ratio, apply the ratio, determine Pythagorean. So it was like 4 steps. And it wasn't necessarily like, it was beyond the normal math canon for the ST, but it took more time. And so they had 3 or 4 of these multi-phase questions, and kids had to practice this. So we had students who got, one of my students at 1480, actually one of my good friends, his kid, it got a 1480 on the practice test. She went in there and took the March test and got a 1350. And she was disappointed because the test 1, 2, and 3 in the Blue Book, the math modules are too easy, and they don't reflect what's real. The new ones they released, test 5 and 6, are much better calibrated, and test 4 is better. So we then began to practice test 4. We began to practice more advanced math. Kid went out there and then got a 1450, and then she's done. Applying to Georgia and a few other schools. So, and that's something we saw, kids across the country began working on more advanced math problems, and then the scores went up. From what I understand, the number of hard questions between March and May was similar. So that's one of the reasons why, March was a big surprise. Wow, this is harder than test 1, 2, and 3. But now that we know, pretty much ignore math hard modules 1, 2, and 3 because they're too easy. And now we know use 4, 5, and 6, they're better calibrated, and students practicing that are getting better. And so a lot of kids, they released test 5 and 6 after the March test, and kids practiced on those for May. That helped them get ready for May. So I think having better, more accurately calibrated practice materials help kids across the country get ready for the May test. Now we know pretty much ignore the hard modules for 1, 2, and 3 in the Blue Book. They're just too easy. And eventually they'll be either improved or made more difficult, or they'll be deleted. This also happened back in 2015-16, when they gave the first 2 tests were just too easy. They weren't calibrated. Eventually they were deleted. What is test blind? Test blind means I can send them a score. I'm applying to UCLA, UC Berkeley. I have a 1590. They don't even look at it. They're blind to it. They can't. And some of them are calling it test free, but it means like they can't look at your test scores. And so that's what test blind is. All right, and there are about 70 schools, about half of them are in California. My incoming senior has a 3.0 GPA, but scored well on his AST. Any data on acceptance rates? All right, so the grades are lower. 3.0 is relatively low. Testing is good. It's going to vary by school. Some schools are going to put more weight on the AST. Some schools put less weight. There are certain schools like Georgia where it's all about the grades and the rigor. And so a 3.0, you can have a 34, but that 3.0 is going to be really tough to overcome in their academic pool because they're very transparent. And there are things called scattergrams. Scattergrams, they're on Naviance, they're on Score, SCOIR. They're also on a few other platforms. And you can look up scattergrams and see. But there are some admissions offices where they really privilege and they really prefer strong GPAs. So great testing can accommodate. But if you have decent grades and strong testing, pull you up. But if your grades are well below what they want for the freshman class, it's going to be tough even with strong testing. So every school is different on their own algorithm, what they weight and to what extent. Do you suggest 10th graders take the SAT, ACT? In my perspective, it's ideal to finish up sophomore year, and then that summer, go to town. We have had some students who are really advanced with math and reading who do really well at the end of sophomore year. But in my experience, there's no real harm in waiting. You don't lose anything. But I mean, I've seen some kids get a 36 at the end of sophomore year. But there's, to me, what you can get it in June, get it in June or get it in July and so forth. Okay. Is there an issue with taking the tests as many times as possible until you get the score you want? Well, not really, except it's just time and resources. And I'd rather kids take more practice tests, get ready for it, and then go in there and knock out the test versus, the stress and going to school and so forth. But most colleges are not going to care, but the vast majority don't care. What type of science topics are on AST? The bio, chem, physics. But here's the thing. It's more foundational concepts, like what's an independent variable? What's a dependent variable in experimental design? What is, there's an issue with measurement error. Or what if, there's an issue with, you had a bad sampling. There was a bad sample size that was skewed. It's more foundational concepts in science in general versus there's a few concepts they're going to ask about. They might ask about meiosis, mitosis, sex cell division versus other cell division. They might ask about inheritance, dominant recessive traits in terms of, inheritance in biology. They may ask a few basic concepts, but it's not an AP exam, but it's more, scientific experimental design versus, otherwise they're going to give you, here's the science concept, here's the physics, here, can you read it? Can you read these charts and tables? Can I read charts and tables skillfully? Can I see correlations? Can I extrapolate beyond points? Not, do I know a ton of bio? But do I understand the framing of how you think about biology and what's a hypothesis? And that is assumed when you get that kind of knowledge. The colleges require the AST writing score. Absolutely not. Some states do. There are like 12 states where it's required to help determine how well the high schools are doing getting kids ready for writing. And it's required for some kids who are from, international kids. They have a TOEFL, but also, I want to see a forced writing sample. But by no means, they dropped it for the SAT, and it's not required at all. I wouldn't feel compelled to take it in the least for the ACT. Rising junior, doing SAT prep this summer or during the school year? If you have time and you have a really strong academic schedule, a bunch of APs and activities, do it this summer. I think summer is a great time. As long as you're not working full time or at summer camp the whole for 10 months. If you have some time, I think doing prep in the summer for a lot of our high flyers makes sense because their lives get crazy come the fall. Because junior year is a tough year academically. What if two folks get a really similar score on the first module, but then one person gets into the easier module, the other gets into the hard one. The first person scores way more on the easier, and the second, okay. No, it's not confusing at all. So two kids, one kid just squeaks into the hard module, one kid just squeaks into the easy module. Then the easy kid crushes the easy module. That kid's capped at a 660, can't get any higher. Then the hard module, if that student, I mean, this is where it actually, and then this student does really poorly on the 22 math items, the kid only gets like 10 right. Still, with that student scoring 10 fewer items right, that kid in the higher module can still score a higher score because of the distribution of, you have 17 easy questions versus you have only 5 in the hard module. So that kid may be answering much more challenging questions, even if he's missing more, and still end up with a hard, and it can vary. This can swing different ways based on, did you answer 10 right here, or you got all 24 right? It's going to vary based on, I can show you 10 scenarios where it varies. So it's not, It depends on the test, on the module, and exactly how many. But there is a little bit of a grade. That's one of the reasons they don't give back, because it is confusing. But this is algorithmic scoring, and they're factoring in the questions and the level of difficulty. But don't try to game this. Don't try to go easy, because again, you're capped. You might get a 650, but if you wanted a 700, you should have gone to the hard module. Okay. Are you required to submit both your scores? Have you took the ST twice? The majority of schools, it's like self-reported, and it's not required to submit everything. Like it's called score choice. I choose to send. You determine what you send. To the there are a couple schools, maybe like one school who wants everything, but everyone else, it's like you choose what you send. My student is a rising junior, took the SAT as a freshman, and then digital as a sophomore. How many more times do you recommend taking it? Well, until you get the scores you need for the schools to make you competitive. I don't know your scores. So if I'm looking at schools that want a 1400, if I'm there, beautiful. If I'm at a 1320, then I might do some serious prep and try to get to that place where my scores become competitive for the schools that are high on my list that I really want to go to. Is it just biology questions asked? No. Science, they're going to ask physics. They're going to ask some chem. They're going to ask, some bio and some other just some basic science questions. If your child has an accommodation for extra time, is that disclosed to the schools? If so, there's a hurt. No, not disclosed. There was a lawsuit in like 2004 where there used to be an asterisk for taken in different conditions. That's a violation of the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and the IDEA. So that's all gone. They don't know. It doesn't hurt you at all. Not in the least. What's the best way to train for the SAT? One-on-one tutoring, ideal duration, number of months and hours per week, intensive training. Yeah, one-on-one tutoring is the most efficient. Groups are also very good for a nice intermediate swatch of like the basic content. Some kids do a group class and then fine-tune with private. That's very popular. But if you're looking for the biggest bang for the buck, hours and investment, every hour private tutoring is more efficient than an hour of group, because I'm focusing only on the student, what they're missing. It's deliberate practice, mastery, orientation. What did you miss and why did you miss it? And it's very, very focused. Best timing, duration, 8-10 weeks. That's ideal. Number of hours per week could be an hour and a half. It could be 2 hours per week, and then do a practice test every 3 sessions. So ideally, I've taken 3 or 4 mock tests. Ideally, and if I'm doing self-prep, and after every 2 hour session that you do with me, or every hour and a half session, I expect you'll do twice as much time doing homework and to reinforce the concepts, make sure you've mastered it. So it could be an hour and a half, 2 hours of practice with a tutor or in a group session. And then at home, you do 3 hours of home work over the course of that over the week, and then you do a practice test every few sessions, and that's how you get ready. So and so forth. All right, a second. All right. Delete. My student who's a rising junior has a 3.7 Hope GPA after first semester in sophomore year. Then after second semester, his Hope GPA went down to 3.6. Even though he has 9 rigorous AP classes, could you advise how does the Hope work? Can the score get higher within 2 years left? Yes. You have a 3.6. You can still get back to the 3.7. You have to get strong grades, but you're still in the running for the full Zell Miller for the Hope Scholarship. You have to have a 3.0 for the regular Hope Scholarship, which is still pretty good. But for the Zell, I believe it's 3.7, and you're still in the range to get there by the time, because you have 2 more full years left. That'll count. That'll determine if you are getting the full Zell Miller or just the standard Hope, which is still pretty darn good. What if you're a student that doesn't test well? Do you have a chance? Absolutely have a chance. At some of the schools where it's test required, that's going to affect you when you're out. But then, and again, there are still like 1,900 schools in the country that are test optional, and some of them don't put the same weight on testing. So you're going to get into a school. We have kids getting into great schools without test scores. My niece applied to Tulane, got Tulane, no testing, and they told her under a 1440, don't send it. They were very clear, and she had a 1390, didn't send it, got into Tulane. She got into South Carolina, a bunch of schools. So if you have good grades, good rigor, you have a chance. You'll get into many, many schools. You might not get into the tip top in the country, but that's okay. There are 2,500 schools. There are several hundred very selective schools. You're going to get into some strong schools. Are the penalties for guessing? No, not at all. Always guess. Is it high? STs were achievable with self-study? Yes. No question it is. You have Khan Academy, you have the Blue Book applications, and certain kids are better at this. Certain kids are better at self-directed study. You know, a lot of kids who get perfect scores, they do their own prep. You know, so without question, yeah, there are many, many students who do very well. But then again, there are many, many students. We've worked with tens of thousands of students who are bright kids, and they're just trying to go from a 1510 to a 1580, or you know, they're working with an expert. You can typically push, maybe you can get there more efficiently, more quickly, but self-study totally works. Time on task, it matters. Where can you get a practice test? You can get a practice test on the Blue Book application. So you go to College Board, type in Blue Book, and there are going to be 6 tests and eventually 8 on there that are real practice tests. And also for the ACT and .org, go on there, and you know, and so they're going to have tests there as well. Is Magoosh? They're okay. Magoosh is all right. You know, Princeton Review books, Kaplan books. Appleruth has a really great book. We have, you know, Horse in That Race, but I helped write it, and it's very comprehensive. But, you know, I don't know. I'd probably go Gruber. I for sure use the official guidebooks. Then, you know, I think Gruber's is good. Kaplan, Princeton, so forth. Can colleges super score between the old ST and the new digital? They can, and many of them have announced they will. Princeton said they won't, but they're the only school I know on record who says you will not super score across. Because honestly, they say there's no calibrating, that a score here should be the same thing as a score there, so there shouldn't be any translation or calibration. If you do the practice on the Blue Book, what kind of feedback is given or what was missed? It does show you what you missed. You can go back and review it. So that feedback is better in the Blue Book than on the official tests, where there is no test return and you don't see the questions or what you missed. But Blue Book is better for that reason. Okay. Is it bad to take online APs, and will colleges recalculate your GPA by taking the online course out because it's not as rigorous, more cheating? No. The online APs, I mean, well, the tests are administered still in the school for the AP. That they're digital. But it's GPA, online APs. I'm not sure, because typically the AP classes are taught not in digital form, but they're taught in an analog form with a teacher in a classroom. The actual exams are going digital, and many of them are being forced digital next year. And then the year after, they're going to add like 16 total. So that shouldn't affect things with GPA. My son is a 1290 SAT and wants to attend Georgia Tech. With mostly APs, 4.2 weighted, his chances. It still has a chance. 1290 is a little bit light for tech. Tech is getting very selective. And you can go on, you know, and see their incoming freshman average for average test scores. The grades look good. I like mostly APs. I may try to push that testing a little bit if that were me, just to get more in their middle 50 range, because they're a strong school. They're selective these days. All right, that's all, yo. Hope you learned something. Please feel free to share this. If you need help with testing, that's what we do for 23 years. We've helped 50,000 kids with these tests. So actually a lot more than that these days. So hope everyone's well, and have a good night. If you need help, reach out, and everyone have a good summer.